straight to a bookstore to try and find something to read about the Alaska Purchase, and what I discovered is that there were no books on the Alaska Purchase. And I couldn't believe this, because this city of Sitka is a big stop for all of these ships, and so a lot of tourists go there, and there was nothing to read about the Alaska Purchase. And so when I got home from the trip, I started to do a little research. I started to Google, and thank goodness for the internet, because it made this easy, and I quickly found out that there were no books that had been written on the Alaska Purchase in English in a very long time. The last book had been written in 1975. And so I decided that this sounded like it would be a good project for me. And so I contacted the University of Alaska Press, and I asked them if they would be interested in me writing a book about the Alaska Purchase, and they said they would love that. And we agreed that I would get the book done in time for the 150th anniversary in 1867. And I was able to do that, and they published the book. That's the cover there. The great thing about it is it gave me opportunities like this. So I have given lectures now on the Alaska Purchase here in Russia in something like 6 or 8 different universities or schools. And I've given lectures on Alaska in a number of places in the United States as well. So I chose wisely when I decided to write about this very interesting topic. Now, what do you guys know about the Alaska Purchase? Do you guys know anything? Maybe a little bit? Do you know anything about some of the myths that go along with the Alaska Purchase? So in the United States, one of the things that people grow up learning is that, that nobody wanted Alaska. That at the time that the government started, talked about buying Alaska, that people didn't want it. They thought it was a ridiculous idea. And so they called it Seward's folly. And what I discovered when I did my research is that's actually not true, and I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. There are also Russian myths. Does anybody know there's one really big popular myth in Russia that used to be in all the textbooks. Yes, that it was a temporary thing. It wasn't really a sale, it was a lease. You know the difference between a sale and a lease in English, right? So, sale, right? If I sell you something, it's yours forever, no question, right? A lease, I might sell it to you, but there's an end date, right? So after a certain number of years, it's supposed to come back to me. It's like kind of a really long-term rent. So it used to be in Russian textbooks here, and apparently recently some books have come out at the time of the anniversary that still said this, but it's not true. And yet every time I give a lecture on Alaska in Russia, or even in the United States, or if there's a Russian in the audience, someone will come up to me and say that it wasn't a sale, it was a lease. But this is just a misunderstanding. So, as I started asking you guys what you knew, does anybody brave enough now to volunteer what you know about Alaska? Anybody want to test their English out on me? No? Students never want to raise their hand first. Who's brave enough? What year did we buy it? 1867. Good, good. Does anybody know how much we paid you for it?
$2 million.
$7.2 million, right. And so most Americans know that too. And when you divide that $7.2 million, it comes up to about 2 cents an acre, which is, an American measure of land. And so people usually know we bought Alaska for 2 cents an acre also. But that's kind of it. So when I was telling people like, oh, I'm writing a new book on the Alaska Purchase, they would say, Seward's folly. And I would say, well, not really. And they would say, oh, $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre, that's all they knew. And so I heard the same thing over and over again. But I decided to name the book Seward's Folly because that's what everybody knew. But in reality, as we're going to see in a minute, it wasn't a folly at all. In fact, it turned out to be a very good investment for us, and it was something that Russia needed to sell as well. So it was a good deal for both countries. All right. So one thing that most people don't realize is that even though the sale didn't occur till 1867, there were some conversations about the future of Russian America as early as the period of the Crimean War. So all of you probably know from your history classes, right, that the Crimean War took place between 1853 and 1856, and that it was a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And at some point, France and Great Britain joined in on the side of the Ottoman Empire. During the war, the Russian government became worried about its Russian-American possessions. So, you know, Alaska, they weren't calling it Alaska yet, right? But Russian America was so far away, they were worried about defending it, especially against Great Britain. Because remember, Great Britain had territory north of the United States in what we now call Canada, right? British North America. So Russia was very worried about perhaps the British trying to seize Alaska. And so the Russians came up with an idea. They decided to carry out a fictitious or a fake sale. So what they were going to do is they were going to pretend to sell Russian America to a group of merchants in San Francisco. So it was just make-believe, but you know, would have meant that then Great Britain couldn't seize it. But before they actually carried out this fake sale, Great Britain declared that Russian America would be excluded from the war. And so, and the reason they did that is because they were afraid that if Russia felt threatened, they might just give Russian America to the United States. And certainly Great Britain didn't want that. So Great Britain said, okay, Russian America is kind of, you know, off to the side, it's off the table, we won't mess with it during the war. And so the sale never took place. But just this conversation started to make people think about this, think about the possibility of what if the United States sometime decided it wanted Russian America, or what if Russia was interested in selling. And so what we see is this starts to become a conversation in the newspapers of the period. So here's a newspaper article from this time, and it's just a quote, but I'll read it to you and you can follow along, right? The New York Herald began to say that the United States should definitely look into buying Alaska, or Russian America. Delay will preclude the possibility of our acquiring it, and will in all probability have the effect of aiding Great Britain in its promised conquest and adding further strength to a rival whose power is already but too formidable on this continent. So what that's saying is they're saying if we don't do it soon, right, Great Britain will do it. Right? And it will help Great Britain take all of that territory in the north. So the New York Herald was one of those newspapers that started to talk about the possibility of this. And in fact, this became such an interesting idea that several politicians approached the Russian minister in the United States and they asked him, would Russia be interested in selling Russian America? His name was Edward de Stokel. At this time, Stokel said no, Russia's not interested in this. And that's pretty much where the conversation stopped for a little while. But then, the Crimean War came to an end. And of course, as you probably know, Russia was defeated in the Crimean War. And that defeat made Russian officials start to think about what they needed to do. One of the things that became clear is that Russia needed reforms. And so remember, this is the time of Alexander II, who took over during the Crimean War when his father Nicholas I died. And Alexander II is known as the reformer czar or the liberator czar, right? And so Alexander carried out a lot of reforms after the Crimean War. Some of them were military, some of them were financial or legal, all sorts of different reforms. But it also meant this defeat, of the Crimean War, it also made Russian officials start to kind of think about the future, think about what their plans were. And they start to think that maybe it was time to consider letting go of the Russian-American colonies. And the strongest spokesperson for that at the time was Konstantin Nikolaevich, who was Tsar Alexander II's brother. And Konstantin Nikolaevich said, you know, this colony is very expensive, it's difficult to defend, it's so far away. The colony's not making a lot of money. It's not terribly successful for us, and maybe we should invest this money elsewhere. He was particularly interested in developing stronger trade relations with Asia. Now, he was pretty much the only person at this time who was very vocal about this, but he made good arguments, and so the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose name was Alexander Gorchakov, decided to investigate this. He did a little bit of research, and he decided that, yeah, it would be possible to sell Russian America, but only after the contract of the Russian American Company, which was the company that was running Russian America, only when their contract expired, and their contract would expire in 1861. But before 1861 rolled around, more conversations took place about the possible sale of Russian America. So other officials began to consider this as well. Now you remember a little earlier, Stokel had said Russia wasn't interested, but obviously now there's a conversation going on about this, and so Stokel had a different approach. He began to worry about Russian America. He worried about American expansionism, because of course if you guys know much about American history, you know we started off small and then we grew, we moved west, right? And so there were a lot of politicians in the United States who were very interested in American expansion. And so Stokel began to worry about that. He was also worried that possibly the relations between the Russian American Company and the United States might affect Russian American relations. So the Russian American Company and the United States sometimes had arguments about trade, or especially about fishing and fur trading, things like that. So he was worried that that might damage the Russian American relationship. And finally, he was worried about the possibility of Mormons moving to Alaska. Do you guys know who the Mormons are? This religious group in the United States that was founded in the middle of the 19th century, and they moved west, right? Now they're all in, I mean not all, but you know, Utah is the center of their religious base now. There are more Mormons in Russia. So you've heard of Mormons, right? So he began to worry that the Mormons might move up into Alaska. So he began to reconsider this possibility. And one of the things that he wrote is, any maritime power with which we shall be at war could take them from us. So he also began to recognize that Russian America was very hard for Russia to defend in the event of a war. That if they went to war with anybody, that other government might take over. Another Russian official who began to recognize the possibility of selling Russian America was this guy, Admiral Popov. And he was particularly concerned about American expansionism. And I found this great quote from him in which he said, anyone who has lived in the North American life cannot fail to understand instinctively that this principle is entering more and more into the blood of the people, and that new generations are sucking it in with their mother's milk. So he's saying here, right, that this is becoming such a sort of a central part of who America is, who Americans are, that children are sucking it in with their mother's milk. It's something that children are almost being born with at this point, the idea that America should continue to expand. So this was another strong argument in favor of selling Russian America. Now, before any of these conversations could go much farther, something big happened in the United States that sort of put everything on hold. Can anybody think of what happened in the United States?
Civil War.
The Civil War. Great. Who said that? Great. Are you a student here or a teacher? Teacher. Yes, the American Civil War. So before any of these conversations about possibly selling or buying Russian America could happen, America was thrown into civil war, right? And this was this incredibly violent and horrible civil war for 4 years. And so during that period of time, the United States was not thinking about acquiring any more territory, right? Everything was on the back burner. But Russian-American relations actually continued to improve during the American Civil War. So, for example, in 1863, Russia sent a fleet to the United States to visit. Did you guys know that? Maybe you read it in your history books at some point. So, while the true meaning of that is probably that Russia was trying to protect its fleet. Okay, so let's go back a second. In 1863, do you know what else happened? What happened in the Russian Empire in 1863? That's right, 61, serfdom was abolished. 63, there was a Polish uprising in the Polish part of the empire, right? And the Russian government quickly put that down, but they knew that France and Great Britain were sympathetic to the Poles, and so the Russian government was afraid that the British or the French might try and block the Russian fleet in its own ports, in its own waters. And so the government of Russia sent the fleet away to visit the United States. So Russia had its own reasons for doing this, but when the Russian fleet came to visit the United States during the Civil War, in America, in the North, of course, the people there saw this as a sign of friendship. And the fleet came, and part of it went to New York, and part of it went to San Francisco. And people in the United States went bananas over this. They saw this as a huge sign of Russian friendship. This is the way it was described in the newspapers, and it continued to be remembered that way for a very long time. So in 1871, after what we're talking about now, but in 1871, Alexander II sent his son, Grand Duke Alexis, to the United States to visit. And when Alexis was here, everywhere he went, in every ball, at every banquet, they talked about how Russia was America's true friend, that Russia had shown friendship during America's darkest moments, during America's darkest hour. So this sending of the fleet turned out to be a really important moment in Russian-American relations, because America really appreciated this, and they continue to remember it for years and years afterwards. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk to you about the Grand Duke Alexis's trip. That would have to be another lecture on another day, but that's also a very interesting story. But we have to move past that now. So that was in 1871, 72. And at that point, as I said, people were still talking about Russia and America as really great friends, right? All right, there was one other thing that brought the United States and Russia together during this particular period. And this was a mutual distrust for Great Britain. So again, we can't go into that story too deeply, but Russia and Great Britain had a lot of conflicts at this time. Some of it involved trading and fishing rights, but some of it also involved, of course, territory on the mainland of Europe. So Russia, of course, was very eager to grab more territory where the Ottoman Empire was. You guys probably know at that point in history, the Ottoman Empire was growing weak. It was known as the sick man of Europe. And the problem of what was going to happen to the Ottoman Empire was known as the Eastern Question. And all of Europe was worried about what would happen when the Ottoman Empire finally fell. And the countries of Western Europe were particularly concerned because they knew Russia wanted some of that territory. And Russia was this giant, strong country, and also very close. So Russia could get there quicker than, say, Great Britain. So Russia and Great Britain had a conflict there, and they had other conflicts other places. The United States also had conflicts with Great Britain. Again, some of it over trade, some of it over that North American territory, British North America, right? And even though there were no really solid ideas, no really solid plans for the United States to try and take that British territory to the north, there were movements. So there were people both in British North America and the United States who thought that that would be a good idea if the United States took some of that territory. And so this was a conflict as well. And actually this concern, this worry that the United States might try and take some of that North American territory ultimately led to the formation of the first manifestation of Canada. So it was Canadian Confederation. Canadian Confederation during that period of time. Okay? All right, so when we get to the real story of how the Alaska Purchase took place, one of the most important people involved was this guy right here, William Seward, right? So when you hear Seward's Folly, that's who they're talking about. He was the Secretary of State in the United States. He had served under Lincoln, and he had actually been injured the night that they assassinated Lincoln. So, you know, the assassination of Lincoln, took place in the theater. You probably know that story, right? But it was actually a much larger conspiracy, and there were people in other places that they attacked as well. And Seward was actually in his home when someone barged in and stabbed him. They tried to kill him as well. So he was actually injured during that attack. He was a really ardent expansionist. So he believed very strongly in the idea of American expansion. He dreamed of America growing and expanding. And in fact, he was quite vocal about this. He talked about it a number of times. So this is a quote from him in 1860. "Standing here and looking far off into the northwest, I see the Russian as he busily occupies himself in establishing seaports and towns and fortifications. And I can say, go on and build up your outposts all along the coast. They will yet become the outposts of my own country." So this is a very arrogant statement, right? He's saying, I'm looking at the Russians building all this stuff, and I'm saying, go ahead, build, because we're going to take that eventually, right? So it's kind of a really obnoxious and arrogant statement 7 years before we even had the opportunity to buy Russian America. But this gives you some idea of how he viewed the world. He thought that American expansion into those areas was inevitable, that it was going to happen at some time or another. Now, Seward then was the American representative. And of course, as I already presented to you, the Russian representative was named Edward de Stokel, right? So right around this time, end of 1866, early 1867, the Civil War has ended, and now everyone is thinking about perhaps the sale of Russian America again. And so finally, Stokel goes home for a visit, and he talks to the emperor about this, and the emperor gives him permission to start negotiations. So he returns from Russia in February of 1867, and then he extends to Seward, an offer that, we can start talking about this. And so between March 11th and March 30th, Stokel and Seward met several times to discuss what the terms of this arrangement would be, what the terms of the treaty would be. And they both had things that they wanted. So, for example, Stokel wanted the United States to honor the obligations of the Russian-American Company. So, of course, the Russian-American Company had trade agreements with various other institutions and bodies, right? And so the Russians wanted to make sure that the United States would honor those obligations. Stokel said no. So then Seward said, well, can we keep the buildings that belong to the Russian-American Company when we buy this territory? And Stokel said, yes, sure. But Stokel came back with something else, and he said, if we're going to let you have those buildings, can we raise the purchase price? And Seward said, sure. So during these early conversations, they started to sort out the details of the treaty. And I'm making it very simple here. There are, of course, lots more details that would be too much to talk about. But at this point, the selling price got up to $7 million as they agreed to this. Now, once they had agreed to this, the Seward went to the president, who of course was now Andrew Johnson. He talked to Johnson, and Johnson gave his approval. They presented it to Johnson's cabinet. Those are the ministers, we call them ministers here in Europe, right? The ministers who were closest to the president, and they all approved. And Stokel contacted Alexander II to let him know that there was this rough draft of a treaty that had been drawn up. And the emperor said, that's good, I approve, but I have some demands as well. And so the emperor, again emphasized he wanted the Russian-American Company's obligations to be honored by the United States. And he also asked that the United States pay for Alaska earlier. The original agreement was that the United States would pay for Alaska 10 months after the treaty was signed. And Alexander II said, we want the money sooner. All right? So, after they received Alexander II's approval, Stokel and Seward called together their secretaries and their clerks late in the evening of March 29th. And then, over the next hours, they continued to work on the final agreements for the treaty. Okay? And in these final agreements, again, Seward said that they would not honor the obligations of the Russian-American company, and they also would not pay any earlier, but as a consolation prize, so as in agreement to this, they offered to give Russia $200,000 more dollars. So this is how the price got from $7 million to $7.2 million. Now these negotiations took place in the middle of the night, right? And of course, on both sides of in the United States and in Russia, the conversation had taken place only between a few people. And so, of course, it seemed like this had taken place overnight. It did literally, but of course there was a long history to it. It also seemed like maybe there was something secretive about it, and that's one of the reasons that we have these kinds of myths about the Alaska Purchase. Finally, at 4 in the morning, they drafted up the 2 treaties, one in English and one in Russian, and they signed the treaties, and the deal was done. Okay? Now, what did Americans think about this? Well, as I said just a moment ago, we know that most Americans had no idea this was happening because it had been done sort of secretively. And so the next day, when this appeared in the newspapers, people were shocked. They were surprised. They couldn't believe it. They thought, in some cases, they thought it was a joke at first. Now, the myth that I told you about earlier is that nobody wanted it, that people said it was a horrible idea. And there were some people who said that, as we'll see, but that's actually not true. By and large, most people in the United States were either neutral or they were in favor of it. They were a little confused because they didn't really know anything about Alaska. And you can see that cartoon kind of gives you that idea, right? That they thought that we had just bought a piece of territory that was just filled with snow and ice and bears. They didn't really know, but they were in favor of it by and large. So here are some of the positive comments that appeared in American newspapers at the time of the purchase. So one newspaper, the New York Times, called it an important annexation. The New York World called it an advancing step in that manifest destiny, which is yet to give us British North America. So that particular quote shows that people were thinking that this might lead to us also taking North American territory, right? And then here, this quote from the Sacramento Daily Union says, "There is support for the treaty on the West Coast, a remarkable unanimity of sentiment on the subject." And in the West, in San Francisco, what was becoming California, in that area, they were excited because they thought this would facilitate trade with Asia. So the acquisition of more territory in North America on the West Coast, that would help trade with Asia, which they were very much in favor of. Now there were some naysayers, some negative Nellies at first. So for example, the New York Tribune said it's certainly not worth $7 million, right? And again, this was because of the misperception that there was nothing there. Some people called it Mr. Seward's chimerical project, a frozen desert of a colony. So they thought, it was just ice. And then here, Harper's Weekly said, that vulgar sense of national honor which mistakes size for splendor. So they were criticizing the idea that bigger is always better, right? That you don't have to always have more. And they thought that it kind of vulgar, that we were trying to just grow for the sake of growing. Now, as you would probably not be surprised to know, the greatest opposition to the Alaska Purchase came from politicians. So, as in all countries, even in the 19th century and today in the 21st century, politicians argue a lot, right? They don't agree on things. And so this is what we see here as well. So there were a lot of politicians in Washington who didn't like the Alaska Purchase. Some of them were, some of the same arguments, right? So some of them thought we were buying just this wasteland of snow and ice, and that there was nothing there, that it wasn't worth that much money. Some people were offended by the idea of expansionism. So some politicians said, why don't we worry about the territory we already have before we try and get more territory? Others pointed out the fact that, this money could be spent elsewhere. So if you guys, again, remember your lessons on the American Civil War, the South was really destroyed by the Civil War. And so there were areas in the South where railroads had been destroyed and roads had been destroyed and bridges. And so, you know, the politicians who argued this said, you know, the money could be used to help rebuild the South, to get them back on track. And then finally, there were some politicians who just didn't like the Alaska Purchase because they didn't like the men who wanted it. So there were people who did not like President Andrew Johnson or Secretary of State William Seward. And so they just didn't want whatever those guys wanted. So there were lots of arguments on Capitol Hill about the future of this Alaska Purchase. Now there were also lots of opinions, very strong opinions in Europe. Okay, so one of the things that when I was doing my research, no one really had talked about this before. But as you can imagine, when in the middle of, you know, out of nowhere, suddenly there's an announcement that Russia and America have signed this very important treaty, and that Russia is selling America this giant chunk of territory, that got a lot of reactions in Europe. So just very quickly, to remind you what else was going on in this period, right? Because this was a very tumultuous period in European history. This is the period when both Germany and Italy were going through their processes of unification. So, you know, like I said at the beginning, I'm a history teacher, right? So I got to bring in all the history. So you guys probably remember from your history classes, right, that there was no such thing as Germany or Italy in 1800, let's say, at the beginning of that century, right? Those were fragmented states. They hadn't been brought together yet. By 1871, those were complete. But in 1867, they were still in the process, but they'd already been moving in that direction. So there had been wars, and there had been movement of territory. One of the countries that lost a lot of territory was Austria. So Austria had lost territory to both Germany and to Italy. And actually, it put such pressure on Austria, on the Austrian Empire, that they had to finally make a compromise with the Magyar population in their empire, what we now would refer to as the Hungarians. And it's called the Compromise of 1867. And it's at this point that the Austrian Empire becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It becomes a dual monarchy, right? And then one other conflict, which I actually didn't know that much about before I did this research, but when I read the newspapers from the period, I discovered that it was a really huge deal, was a conflict over Luxembourg. France and Prussia almost went to war over this conflict, and it was in the newspapers every single day. So there was lots going on in 1867 in Europe. And so when suddenly this announcement comes out about the treaty between Russia and the United States, not surprisingly, these countries were concerned. One of the big concerns was that somehow this would mean that the United States was going to get more involved in European affairs. And nobody wanted that. Nobody in Europe wanted that. So let's look at some of the reactions to the announcement of the Alaska Purchase in Europe. First of all, one of our representatives in Frankfurt was named William Murphy, and he said that it made a deep and exciting impression in the various political circles in Europe, that people were very, very struck by this, right? That they were alarmed, and they were paying attention now to what this meant, and coming up with all sorts of guesses about what it meant. Cassius Clay, who was our representative in St. Petersburg, said that, you know, he believed that if any of this had gotten out beforehand, so if any of these conversations about the Alaska sale had actually been known before the treaty was signed, he thought that probably there could have been opposition to it and even armed intervention, that some other countries may have tried to stop it had they known about it. And he referred to Russia's and America's long friendship and said, the strange and unexpected good alliance between Russia and America has taken them by surprise and disabled all their projects. So he said the other European countries are, you know, they're worried about this now, and any plans they had to try and sort of like keep Russia and America, you know, away from each other are now ruined. And finally, a German newspaper called the Neue Freie Presse said, we are told that the government of the United States has obligated itself in an agreement for the cession of Russian America in support of the Russian government in the Orient and using the American Navy if necessary. So this is referring to the Eastern question, to the question of what's going to happen to the Ottoman Empire. And of course what this article is suggesting is that part of the treaty was an agreement that the United States was going to offer some kind of support. So maybe it would only be moral support, but it might actually also be the American Navy. And this was very, very alarming to the other countries in Europe. They were already worried enough about Russia. The last thing they needed was the American Navy to get involved as well. Even Karl Marx had something to say about the Alaska Purchase. And when I found this out, first of all, I thought it was funny. And secondly, I put it in because you guys are all too young to know this, but during the Soviet era in Russia, you could not publish a book without quoting Marx in it, right? It didn't matter. You could be writing a cookbook. You could be writing a book about, I don't know, dog care. It didn't matter what you were writing. The front of your book had to have a quote from Karl Marx, right? This was just, right? And so, or Lenin, right? You know, so when I found that Marx also had something to say about the Alaska Purchase, I thought, for humor's sake, I need to throw that in. But he actually had a very smart observation. What he said was, from the economic side, and I joked with the last audience, of course he would be talking about the economic side, right? Because that's all Marx was interested in, was economics, basically. So, from the economic side, this acquisition for the present is not worth a cent. But thanks to this, the Yankees will cut England off from the sea from one side and hasten the annexation of all British North America to the United States. That's where the dog is buried. So this is actually a really great quote for that reason, because he's talking about, again, another fear that European countries had, that this was just another step toward the United States taking over all of North America, which would make the United States bigger and stronger. So as I mentioned to you earlier, this was a very real fear, right? So this is the year of Canadian Confederation, and part of the reason that the British got this movement going and started actually cooperating with Canadian efforts to come up with some kind of confederation is because of all of this, because Great Britain began to worry also about the United States being interested in taking its North American possessions. All right, well, there were other reactions in other parts of Europe as well. So first we're going to talk about French reactions. And I told the audience that I spoke to the other day, this slide has always been in my presentation, so it's just coincidence that, you know, it's this slide after the tragedy of the church burning a week ago. And so there were lots of responses in France. So one French newspaper said, only the English provinces now lie between the Americans and the realization of their proud program. So again, the French recognized the potential for the United States to take over all of North America. But they also said this sale is not, its importance is not limited to the New World. So it's not just North America that we need to worry about with this sale. We also need to worry elsewhere. Today's ceding of territory by the Russians cannot fail to strengthen the paradoxical relationship between Tsar Alexander and President Johnson. So, do you guys know what the word paradoxical means? Paradox? Yeah. So, you know, so people were puzzled by the friendship between Russia and America. And even some Americans and Russians were puzzled by the friendship. In some ways, it didn't seem to make sense. The United States was the representative of democracy, and Russia had this absolute monarchy. So one might think that they had nothing in common. But during this period of time, Russia and America actually worked very hard to find things in common. So of course, you guys liberated your serfs in 1861. We liberated the slaves in 1863. And so Alexander and Lincoln were often compared to one another. And when Lincoln was assassinated, Russia sent these letters of condolences to the United States. Russia was very affected by it. People were very sad about this. And then in 1863, when someone attempted to assassinate, or 1866, someone attempted to assassinate Alexander II, we sent an envoy. We actually sent someone over to deliver in person this, letter of condolence saying, like, we're so sorry this happened, but thank goodness you're okay. And then when Alexander II was later assassinated by terrorists, we were very sympathetic as well. So there was lots of back and forth during this period, and the two countries worked very hard to find things in common. And so, I showed you the cover of my other book on Alexis. his visit really shows that, where everywhere he went, people talked about the reasons Russia and America were friends and the things that they had in common. So people were puzzled by this friendship, but they were worried about it as well, because they didn't know what might happen. Not surprisingly, the Ottoman Empire was very worried about this, right? The Ottoman Empire knew it was in trouble, that there were lots of countries who were hoping to take pieces of it when it began to crumble. And so the Ottoman Empire was also concerned. So Ottoman officials were worried, and the sort of government, sort of the newspaper that spoke for the government, said, they called the announcement a bomb bursting in the midst of very complicated situations charged with tempest. So they said, this is a complicated time, and the announcement was like a bomb. And they were worried that this would operate to the serious detriment of Turkey. So they, again, were concerned about the United States offering support to Russia during this period of time. Now, we got to the point already where the treaty was signed, right? And Edward de Stokel sent a copy of it to Alexander. Alexander approved it, and it came back to the United States. But it was a lot more complicated than that, right? So what happened next is, after the treaty was signed by the two representatives, Russia and the United States, they had to get it approved by the American government. So the treaty was signed at 4 in the morning, and Congress met at 10 in the morning. So only 6 hours after the treaty was signed, Seward presented the treaty to Congress. And this was, by the way, the last day of the congressional session. So at noon, they were actually going to close until the fall, right? Because Congress is in session, for various periods of time. So obviously, when Congress was presented with this treaty, when the Senate was presented with this treaty, there was no way they could make this kind of decision in 2 hours, and so it was decided that they would have to have a special session for the next couple of weeks to make this decision. Over the next couple of weeks then, Seward worked really hard to convince people that this was a good idea. He had dinners at his house. He invited all these politicians to his house where he served them meals and, gave speeches. He invited people who had been to Alaska to give speeches and also to write articles that they then published in the newspapers. And these things actually worked. So especially for the public, people didn't know much about Alaska, but when they started reading these articles about Alaska and how it had beautiful scenery and it had great fishing, and it had lots of animals with furs, and it had trees and minerals and all sorts of other things, then people began to see it as, a more exciting prospect, that this was actually a good idea. Stokel was also at work trying to convince people to vote in favor, and we know, as a matter of fact, that he distributed some bribes. We've actually found documentation of this, right? Because things began to get a little difficult during the summer or later on, and he starts actually giving a few people money to persuade them to vote in favor of this. Well, of course, as I said, there were still people who were against it, but during the deliberations, they expressed all their concerns, and ultimately, they voted in favor of the treaty. And so the treaty was ratified. Right? So the Senate ratified the treaty. Hoorah. But, of course, nothing is that simple in the American government. And in fact, Stokel complained that it was incredibly difficult to work with Americans. He said, you have to talk to everybody, you have to convince them all, and it takes forever. And of course, it's an interesting quote from Stokel because he's comparing it to the Russian government. And at that time, the only person whose opinion really mattered was the Tsar, right? If the Tsar said yes, done deal. But in the United States, you had to go through all of these politicians and you had to get enough people to vote in favor of it. And Stokel found that very exhausting. And he said the 25,000 rubles that he got as payment really wasn't enough. He was exhausted. He just wanted to go back to Russia. And that's what he would eventually do when everything was done. But after the treaty is ratified, that's not the end of it, right? There's still a next step that has to happen. And the next step is that the other part of Congress, the House of Representatives, has to actually vote in favor of paying for Alaska. So it sounds kind of weird, But that's the way it was set up, right? That's the way it's set up. So the Senate voted, yes, we will sign this treaty for the sale of Alaska, but the House of Representatives had to say, yes, we'll pay for Alaska. And before that second meeting took place, because remember Congress was ending, right, its session, before that meeting took place, the United States took possession of Russian America. So this is actually, obviously, a modern photograph of Sitka. And I love this photograph because, you know, it combines the various cultures there. So you have a totem pole, which of course is, you know, related to the native population there. But on top of, or in the middle of the totem pole is a double-headed eagle with St. George slaying the dragon in the middle. So it's a great combination of cultures. So on October 18th, 1867, the United States took possession of Alaska. And on that day, a small group of Russian American officials and also some Russian residents from Sitka gathered together, and they watched as the Russian flag was lowered over Sitka and the American flag was raised over Sitka. It was a very small ceremony, very sort of, you know, simple. They weren't giant speeches or anything like that. But that was the easy part, because then the hard part was figuring out how to divide up all the things in Sitka. So remember, the United States had gotten permission from Russia to take possession of all the buildings that belonged to the Russian American Company. But it was very difficult. Hurry? Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, all right. So right now? Okay, all right. So okay. Yes, Russia got the money. Let me quickly speed through the rest, okay? So, whoops. So the House of Representatives, as I said, had to approve it, right? And since we have to hurry, I'll speed through this. So that didn't start until the next summer, so we'd already taken possession of it. And the problem with this was that the House of Representatives had to approve paying for it, but in fact we already had taken ownership of it. And so they felt like they were stuck. They didn't really have much of a choice. They kind of resented that, but in the end they voted in favor of paying for Alaska. And I'll skip over that. And so then on August 1st, 1868, Seward sent notice for the bank to send Stokel a treasury draft for $7.2 million. He received it, and he did deposit that money, and Russia did get all of their money. So that's another rumor that somehow the United States never paid. And these are just some pictures of Alaska. So even though, whoops, what does that keep happening? So even though people have some misunderstandings about Alaska, about how the sale took place, it was a definitely good deal for both Russia and the United States. The United States got this incredible piece of territory. Russia got money that it needed at the time, and it also got rid of a colony that was really becoming too difficult to handle, so that Russia could concentrate its efforts and its money elsewhere. So that's it. Sure.